Origins of Modern Liberalism, Woodrow Wilson, Lecture 3. In the last lecture, I talked primarily about Woodrow Wilson's diagnosis of the problems faced by the United States of America and the way that the social and economic changes brought about by industrialization have created a new form of inequality in society where a very small number of people, because of their control over large corporations, have outsized power and influence in American society, and the vast mass of Americans are actually sort of disempowered in their lives. They have less control over their social and economic conditions than they had before. And Wilson drew from this the claim that government under modern conditions can no longer settle simply with the protection theory of government being there to prevent harm, but has to adopt a more active approach to reconstruct social and economic conditions to make them more equitable and more prosperous for average people. Now, as I mentioned in the last class, that if you think that the purpose of government is protecting the natural rights of individuals, then this sort of view of an active government that tries to remold society would be an overstep in the legitimate powers of government. And Wilson, in the rest of the reading that I give you, goes on to give a little bit more of a pointed critique of the founding principles and the need to update them. He doesn't say reject. He's not quite like Merriam in these speeches in terms of being quite so pointedly critical, but he argues that American political principles have to be updated. And I gave you a little bit of something from him before that. He draws this contrast between the founders' understanding of sort of what the model of scientific understanding is and the modern understanding. And this is his contrast between Newton on the one side and Darwin on the other. And this is about 2/3 of the way down page 188, where he was talking about he had a conversation with somebody who said, in every age, there are certain kind of dominant metaphors or paradigms that shape the way people think about things. Just think about nowadays how much the language of hardware and software that comes from computers shapes the way we talk about, say, the soul and the brain and stuff like that. So there's that way in which, kind of metaphors can guide our thinking. And Wilson, upon having this conversation, he reflects, he says, "Now it came to me as this interesting man talked that the Constitution of the United States had been made under the dominion of the Newtonian theory." So Isaac Newton, Newtonian physics, one which is an account of the laws of matter in motion and the transference of force. So, in the 1700s, Newton was the model of a scientist, and Newtonian physics was the model science in terms of its principles, its predictions, and all of that. It says, "You have only to read the papers of the Federalist to see that fact written on every page. They speak of the checks and balances of the Constitution and use to express their idea the simile of the organization of the universe, and particularly the solar system, how by the attraction of gravitation the various parts are held in their orbits, and then they proceed to represent Congress, the judiciary, and the president as a sort of imitation of the solar system." Right. So he talks about this kind of adoption of a mechanical view of things, Newtonian mechanics as the model. It says, "The makers of our federal constitution read Montesquieu with true scientific enthusiasm. They were scientists in their way, the best of their age, those fathers of the nation. Jefferson wrote of the laws of nature, and then by way of an afterthought of nature's God. And they constructed a government as they would have constructed an orrery, to display the laws of nature. Politics, in their thought, was a variety of mechanics, and the Constitution was founded on the law of gravitation. The government was to exist and move by virtue of the efficacy of checks and balances." That's the top of page 189. So an orrery, that's like a mechanical, if you've ever seen one of these mechanical models of the solar system where you can crank them or whatever, and the planets all orbit on their axes and orbit around one another, that's what an orrery is. So this kind of idea that you construct the government like a machine that you sort of keep in kind of perpetual mechanical motion through checks and balances and things like that. And he criticizes this view of the mechanical view of government. He says, the trouble with the theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, physics, but under the theory of organic life, biology. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its functions by the sheer pressure of life. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live. On the contrary, its life is dependent upon their quick cooperation, their ready response to the commands of instinct or intelligence, their amicable community of purpose. Government is not a body of blind forces. It is a body of men with highly differentiated tasks, differentiated functions, no doubt, in our modern day of specialization, with a common task and purpose. So he says there can be no successful government without the intimate, instinctive coordination of organs of life and action. This is not a theory, but fact, and displays its force as fact, whatever theories may be thrown across its track. Living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. Society is a living organism and must obey the laws of life, not of mechanics. It must develop. End of quotation. I read that. It's kind of long, but it's important because you can see the connection with a few different aspects of his thought. But I want to say a little bit of something about the importance of Darwin for political debate during this time. So The Origin of Species is published in roughly 1859, or is it 69? I always forget. I think it's 59. The basic argument for it being that instead of each animal species being specially created, that actually species under pressure from the environment evolve over time, and new species emerge from old ones with new characteristics that are selected for, this is natural selection, by the way they help or hinder reproduction within their particular environment. Darwin almost immediately became obviously very controversial. The theory was very controversial, but the mantle of Darwin also became important within politics because different political groups drew different lessons from Darwin for politics. I mean, obviously, since Darwinian theory applies to all life forms, it was natural for people to think that in some way or another, the Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection might have something to teach us about the proper way to structure human society. And you end up with kind of two, just speaking very generically here, you end up with kind of two schools of thought. The one that people have normally heard of is what's usually referred to as social Darwinism, which tended to be associated with those who were defenders of limited government, defenders of a laissez-faire approach to the economy, for the most part, leaving the economy unregulated. And social Darwinism, kind of by and large, its message was the law of life is the law of competition. If you want to make progress, you must let competition happen. So in the same way that life forms compete in order to survive, and you end up with the survival of the fittest, it's the same thing in society. If you want your society to improve, you have to leave people to compete with one another so that those who are the most hardworking and the most talented may be rewarded, and those that are not talented or not hardworking, that in one way or another are a social liability, will fail, right? And the message of social Darwinism is free up competition and let the losers lose. And don't provide, some kind of social safety net to help the losers, because that will just drag society down. They have failed because, in effect, they don't have what it takes to succeed. Now, again, it's a caricature, and some of the people who are associated with social Darwinism are actually much subtler and more interesting thinkers than they're usually given credit for. But that's the basic account. So on the right, you might say, the message of Darwin was survival of the fittest, therefore laissez-faire, open competition, let the winners win and the losers lose, and don't have the public authorities step in to help out the losers, because that just drags society down by helping to survive people who really rightfully should fail. So that's social Darwinism. On the left, you get a different message from Darwin. What they take away from Darwin is not survival of the fittest, but the principle of adaptation. that the way to survive and the way to thrive is to adapt to conditions, to adapt to your environment. And as your environment changes, you need to change too in order to adapt. And that's the kind of left Darwinism, like progressive or reform Darwinism um, view. And that's where Wilson's coming in, this kind of idea that living beings change, they evolve, they adapt to a changing environment. And so for him, the lesson for government is we can't stay fixed within old political principles or old political formulas, because even if, say, the principles of the Constitution fit very well the society of the late 1700s or early 1800s, society has changed. And so since society has changed, government too must adapt. Your constitution, to use a well-known phrase, you need to have a living constitution, a constitution that, according to Darwinian principles, evolves with changing social conditions. So this is how he says, so the Newtonian view, the founder's view, is a mechanical view. The government's a machine, let's design it so that it just keeps running. And he says, no. Government's not a machine, it's a living thing, because society's a living thing. And so therefore what works in one time and place might cease to work in the future as circumstances change, as the environment changes. So we need to evolve. We need to make progress, in his view. Now, the other thing he had worked into that passage was his critique of checks and balances, where he said, if you think of the government as a machine that you're trying to keep in balance, then something like checks and balances makes sense. Right? So that in order to keep the whole machine running, you want to make sure that the legislature and the president sort of balance each other out, and that neither one kind of gets too much power and throws off the contraption. But if government's not a machine, he's saying, then the notion of checks and balances is not as well suited. And in fact, if you think about a living thing, so you think about a government, right? A government is made up of different parts. And his point is those different parts have to work together in order to achieve the purposes of government. And so the real goal is to make sure that those different parts of government can work efficiently together. The goal is not to make them check and stop one another. Right? And the analogy he gives is in a living being, the internal organs of a living being each perform a different function that is necessary for the successful functioning of the overall organism, right? Your liver needs to be working, your stomach needs to be working, your heart, your lungs need to be working, your eyes need to be working. You have all these different parts. They all have particular jobs, right? The stomach can't do what the liver does. The heart and lungs can't do what the eye does. So you have all these different organs with specialized functions, but a successful living thing has all of those organs cooperating with one another, right? The liver is not there to check and balance the stomach. Right? The heart is not there to check and balance the lungs. Things are supposed to coordinate. They're supposed to work together. And so that's why for Wilson, the idea of checks and balances is sort of antithetical to good government, because it implies that the different parts of government are in some way supposed to be adversarial to one another, checking each other. Whereas really what you need to do is you need to organize government, especially its administrative capacities, in a way such that all the parts can work together towards the common good, right? And now, obviously, this is an overly simplistic critique of the founding principles. That really is not, while it's true that a lot of metaphors are drawn from Newton in the Federalist Papers, obviously checks and balances are actually there in order to enable the government to perform its function well without any particular body within the government acquiring arbitrary power. So Wilson is in a way kind of leaving out the main point of checks and balances. But it's still the case, as we know, that the way that the Constitution is designed with checks and balances does make it possible for the legislature to frustrate what the executive wants to do, for the executive to frustrate what the legislature wants to do, for the Supreme Court to frustrate what both the executive and the legislature might want to do. So it is true that, our system of checks and balances makes it possible for the different parts of government to stop other parts. And what Wilson wants is a government that can act, sort of energetically, somewhat in the Hamiltonian sense, and with unity of purpose. And that's one of the reasons why, although it's not in the reading, he thinks that the president should be kind of in the driver's seat of the government, because the unity of the office of president is what can provide unity of vision and unity of purpose to the overall political system. So that's why he wants the president to be trying to guide public opinion, guide Congress. So that's Darwin. Darwin is going to come up again, this idea that as conditions change, government has to change. But he immediately moves on to apply this to the principles of the founding. And this is, I'll just begin where he left off. It says, all that progressives ask or desire is permission in an era when development and evolution is a scientific word to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. All they ask is recognition of the fact that a nation is a living thing and not a machine. So it's living constitutionalism, and a constitution that evolves. And later on in the course, I will have some lectures on the debate over living constitutionalism. But as he goes on to say, some citizens of this country have never got beyond the Declaration of Independence signed in Philadelphia, July 4th, 1776. Their bosoms swell against George III, but they have no consciousness of the war for freedom that is going on today. In other words, some patriotic Americans, he thinks really a lot of patriotic Americans, think in a way that when it comes to the principles of politics, that the Declaration of Independence really supplies kind of the final word. What is it? I think Coolidge, right, after Wilson was president, more or less says that. This idea that though these are, people like Locke and the founders thought these are timelessly true principles of government. The notion that we are all created equal is not something that's true in some times and places and not true in others. No, it's rooted in human nature, which is the same everywhere in all times and places. And insofar as human nature remains the same, our rights remain the same, our equal rights remain the same. The need for government to be based on the consent of the governed is something that is true everywhere and always. The notion that the purpose of government is to protect our natural rights is something that is true everywhere and always. These are true principles. So in the same way that, might say the principles of mathematics don't evolve, right? 2 + 2 does not evolve such that it no longer equals 4, but now equals 5, right? 2 + 2 = 4, period. In the same way, the founders and those who hold the founders' view would argue that the equal natural rights, government to secure rights based on the consent of the governed, are timelessly true principles of government. And Wilson is denying that. He's saying, no, that is to remain stuck in the past. You're failing to see that, in fact, the principles of government are historically relative, and that what was good and right in 1776 might not be adequate in 1912. So he goes on to say, the Declaration of Independence did not mention the questions of our day. It is of no consequence to us unless we can translate its general terms into examples of the present day and substitute them in some vital way for the examples it itself gives, so concrete, so intimately involved in the circumstances of the day in which it was conceived and written. It is an eminently practical document meant for the use of practical men, not a thesis for philosophers, but a whip for tyrants, not a theory of government, but a program of action. Unless we can translate it into the questions of our own day, we are not worthy of it. We are not the sons of the sires who acted in response to its challenge. That's a very interesting claim. So in the first place, what he's saying is, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you see that it is very much rooted in its time. And here what he particularly has in mind is the Bill of Particulars, all the various charges in the Declaration of Independence against King George and Britain, that forcing us to quarter troops, dissolving our legislatures, suspending our courts, all those kinds of things. And Wilson's making the, kind of like the obviously true point that if you look at the social or political problems that are outlined in the Declaration of Independence, you can say to yourself, we've solved all of those, right? In 1912, our problem is not that the British monarch is trying to force us to quarter troops in our home, right? It's not a stamp tax. Our problem is not that American sailors are being impressed into service in foreign navies. It's not that our legislatures are being dissolved, that our judges are being fired, or any of those kinds of things, right? So if those are the problems, we've solved them. Congratulations, America, you've done it. Wilson's point is that that's immaterial, though, because we have other problems. that aren't mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. The problems that I talked about in the previous lecture. He says those problems are not mentioned in the Declaration. They were not conceivable at the time of the Declaration because they're problems relative to a form of society, industrial society, that didn't exist at the time of the founding. And so, as he says, we need to translate the Declaration of Independence into modern terms. We need to substitute our own examples for the examples in the Declaration. In order to be worthy of the Declaration of Independence, we must update the Declaration of Independence. And that means for him in particular, insofar as the Declaration of Independence is aimed at overcoming tyranny, we have to ask ourselves, what does tyranny look like today? What is the form or forms of tyranny that we are fighting today? And what must we do to overcome it? And so he's basically suggesting a kind of continuity. The founders fought tyranny as it existed in their day and won. If we are to be worthy of the founders, we must fight tyranny in the form that it exists today and win. And so we need to update the Declaration of Independence. We need to update our understanding of what the fight for freedom looks like. As he says, what form does the contest between tyranny and freedom take today? What is the special form of tyranny that we now fight? How does it endanger the rights of the people? And what do we mean to do in order to make our contest against it effectual? What are to be the items of our new Declaration of Independence? Right, that's near the bottom of page 189. Now, just one thing I want to mention here is, again, Wilson, this is a campaign speech. He is partially misrepresenting the Declaration of Independence, right? Because he says it's not a thesis for philosophers, it's practical, it's a whip for tyrants, it's not a theory of government, but a program of action. That's only half true, because, of course, he's talking about the particular charges against the king, but he doesn't mention the paragraph before that with the most famous statements about all being created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, that government is instituted to secure these rights based on the consent of the governed. I mean, that is a theory of government. It's not at all a complete theory of government. I mean, obviously, look, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence endorsed the Articles of Confederation, only to discover that the Articles of Confederation didn't work that well. So obviously, the Declaration does not contain a complete theory of government, but it does actually articulate many of the first principles of legitimate government as the founders understood it. So in that sense, Wilson is kind of fudging things. But of course, as a kind of a progressive intellectual and progressive political scientist, we know, without having to dig very much, that that theory embodied in the famous second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is one that Wilson thinks is false. Here he agrees with Merriam that those are just false principles. But he doesn't want to reject the founding. He wants to say we need to update the founding. We need to ask ourselves, what does the fight for freedom look like today? What does tyranny look like today? And of course, being a politician, giving a stump speech, he answers his own question with the paragraph that begins at the bottom of page 189. By tyranny as we now fight it, we mean control of the law, of legislation and adjudication, by organizations which do not represent the people, by means which are private and selfish. We mean specifically the conduct of our affairs and the shaping of our legislation to the interests of special bodies of capital and those who organize their use, corporations, the 1%. We mean the alliance, for this purpose, of political machines with selfish business, so corrupt political parties that are more responsive to the interests of the wealthy and the corporations than to the interests of the average citizen. And he makes an interesting point as he continues. He says, we mean the exploitation of the people by legal and political means. We have seen many of our governments under these influences cease to be representative governments, cease to be governments representative of the people, and become governments representative of special interests, controlled by machines, which in their turn are not controlled by the people. End quote. So in other words, what does tyranny look like today? Greedy big business and corrupt political parties. Right? And, if you followed the 2016 election, both sides were saying that. They had different specific bad guys in mind, But one of the interesting things about the 2016 election is that both the Democrats and the Republicans were more or less saying our nation's problems are the result of the fact that we have parties that have been corrupted by by wealthy corporations and are doing the bidding of some powerful elite rather than the good of the people, be it Wall Street or whatever. Now, but as he notes, and this is something that will come up with other progressive authors, he points out, now this he thinks is tyranny today, because what it means is that our public institutions no longer serve the common good, but actually serve the private interests of unaccountable elites. But the facade of free government is still there, right? It's not that there's been a military coup of some kind or an authoritarian dictatorial takeover. You still have elections. You still have elected representatives. You still have elected governors and executives. You still have judges, right? The whole kind of organization of government bequeathed to us by the founding is still there. And his point is, even though the forms of representative government are still there, in substance, government is not representative anymore because it's been corrupted by the wealthy and greedy few. So he would say, so just saying a return to the principles of the founding, that's not going to solve the problem. He would say governing in accordance with the principles of the founding, which entails a laissez-faire approach to the economy, is precisely what has allowed this oligarchy to develop. And so if we are going to fight this oligarchy, what we have to do is find a way to restructure government in order to empower it to overcome the oligarchic corruption that is subject to. We have to break the influence of corrupt party leaders. We have to subject corporations to tighter public regulation in the name of the common good. And so that's what Wilson is calling for. Now, basically a quick Google search will show you some of the progressive reforms that happened during this time that were meant to achieve this. I'll give you some examples. But one thing I want to note is that a lot of the changes, a lot of the reforms that are made during this era, the progressive era, happened more at the state and local level rather than at the national level. There are some changes to the national government, but a lot of changes happen at the state and the local level. So, for example, during the progressive era, this is when you get the legislation of things like a 40-hour work week. People can't be required by their employer to work more than 40 hours. This is when you get child labor laws restricting, what ages people have to be in order to work. This is when you get the passing of workplace safety regulations, the Food and Drug Administration to keep track of the safety of products. This is when you have the beginnings of some of the beginnings of antitrust legislation to break up monopolies in order to make sure that they cannot arbitrarily control prices and things like that. This is also the era when you have the Constitution is amended to give the Congress the power to pass an income tax, so that wealthy citizens can be required to pay a greater proportion of their income in form of taxation. You also have political reforms aimed at breaking the power of what were perceived to be at least corrupt party leaders. But so this is the era, this is when you get women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment. This is when you have the beginnings of primary elections, where instead of party leaders choosing candidates, you make it possible for rank and file members of parties and ordinary voters to determine who presidential candidates will be. So for example, just recently, it wasn't directly the party leaders in the Democratic Party that decided that Joe Biden would be the Democratic Party candidate. It was Biden competed against other people state by state in primary elections, where Democratic voters at the state level were able to cast votes for who they wanted the Democratic candidate to be in the general election. That way of approaching things that begins during the progressive era. And obviously that massively reduces the power of party leaders because they can't just simply pick who represents their party. This is also the progressive era is also when you have the beginnings of the legislating of the private ballot to make sure that parties can't influence people directly by observing who they're voting for. And there are various other developments that happened during the progressive era. So, especially at the state and local level, you have reforms aimed at breaking the power of what were perceived to be corrupt party leaders and tighter regulation of business practices. So, that's where I'll leave off. In the next series of lectures, I will talk about the New Deal and the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, although he wasn't actually also an official in the Wilson administration, as well as, of course, being a relative of Theodore Roosevelt's. So Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal era in the 1930s is very much in continuity with the progressive era in terms of the vision and goals of government. But that will have to wait until next time because this lecture is already too long.